there's a wonderful blessing in every Torah service.
Is there one chair there?
My eyes that I may behold the wondrous things that come forth from your Torah.
Yeah, you can take that one.
Now, that's a blessing that can be really, really difficult for a lot of people to declare, to pronounce.
Anybody need one?
Mainly because the Torah as a whole has not been considered a great and wonderful and magnificent thing by and large the vast majority of the Western body. So when one says, "Open my eyes that I may behold the wondrous things from your Torah," you are proclaiming, you are declaring something that is truly, truly profound and somewhat of an obscurity or an unknown as far as a statement as it pertains to the vast majority of the body. If you were to ask a religious Jew, what is the ultimate purpose of Torah? You would hear something along the lines of, the ultimate goal of the Torah is to bring the world to a place where the Torah is no longer necessary.
Amen.
This concept of what we know of as tikkun olam within Judaism, which translates into a repairing of the world, although there is very much kind of a humanistic element to it, and I don't necessarily wholeheartedly agree with the concept of tikkun olam, but at the same time, it pronounces, it espouses a position of work, of cooperation with our God, in ushering in, eventually, a reality that we don't understand or see in the fullness today, which is the kingdom of God in its fullness, the Messianic kingdom, the Messianic era. The ultimate goal of the Torah is to bring the world to a place where the Torah is no longer necessary. I consider that to be a truly profound statement. The Torah of Adonai is perfect, restoring the soul. The testimony of Adonai is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of Adonai are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of Adonai is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of Adonai is clean, enduring forever. The judgments of Adonai are true. They are righteous altogether. They are more desirable than gold, yes, than much fine gold. Sweeter also than honey and the drippings of the honeycomb. Now again, somewhat obscure, somewhat considered foreign territory for many. If you remember last week in the class, we talked about the differences between how Torah was viewed by David, who considered it a delight, when all of a sudden Shimon, in the context of the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, says, how can we place on the non-Jews a burden that even we or our fathers have been able to bear? Now, why would he call Torah a burden when David calls it a delight? And of course, we went over what Torah, the concept of Torah, and how it evolved over the centuries, what it took on. And we found that many of the oral traditions intertwined themselves so intricately with what was written, the written Torah, that the two were basically indistinguishable from one another. They became inseparable. And when Shimon refers to the yoke that neither we nor our fathers have been able to bear, he's referring to this concept, this hybrid concept, which Yeshua said, listen to what they say because they sit in the seat of Moses, but don't do what they do because they say but don't act. So Yeshua even gave many of this concept of intertwining a certain amount of validity. Okay? And the Talmudim operated in this context, but still it was very, very difficult. It wasn't seen necessarily, when you talk about that hybrid system, in the same way that David saw it when he woke up in the morning yearning for it, thinking of it, when he went to bed at night thinking of it, when he delighted in Adonai's mitzvot and his commandments. That it was drippings of the honeycomb. I don't see any concept of a burden here. And when you understand the idea that those two Torot, the two Torahs, the oral and the written, became one, you can see what Shimon was talking about, what Peter was talking about in Acts chapter 15, when he talks about the burden. So as we set out to take a deeper look into Torah and what it represents, what its origins are, what its purposes were and continue to be, and how it can be applied today in our lives, both Jews and non-Jews alike, one begins to quickly realize the vastness of this topic. Now, I'm not going to pretend that we're going to be covering every aspect of Torah, because of course you know that entire books and volumes are written on just this topic alone. Okay? So we'll touch on some elements, and sadly we won't have time to dissect the subject exhaustively. Plus, that's really not the purpose that I'm setting out to do. These are foundations courses. They're not 5-hour academic yeshiva courses. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that the class is shabby in nature, because we will talk about details. There are probably more details in this class than there will be in most of the other classes, simply because there's so much involved in the concept of Torah that I want to refer to and go over. And there are just so many directions you can go, so I hope that you have mercy on me, and I'm going to do my best not to lose you in what's taking place. So what is Torah? Again, Torah can be seen in many ways and is multifaceted in nature. And for the sake of this study, I've kind of created my own broad overview statement that in its totality, first and foremost, I want to acknowledge, and I think we all acknowledge, that Messiah, Yeshua, is the goal. Like Shaul, like Rabbi Paul says in Romans 10:4, it's not the end of the law. Okay? Messiah is the goal that the Torah is aiming for. He is the fulfillment, the fullness of it all. That doesn't necessarily negate any of the Torah, because if you talk about what we consider to be progressive revelation, you understand that the covenants build on one another, with Messiah at the pinnacle of it all, but Messiah and the covenants don't negate that which they are built upon. We are simply seeing a beautiful building being built. All of it has its place, none of it negating the other. Okay?
Amen.
That it was, is, and will be the agent through which the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob establishes his justice, which is incredible. It's a very, very vital concept to have, that the Torah establishes justice, sovereignty, and will amongst his children Israel, and all those who have chosen through faith to attach themselves to the children of Israel. We talked about the physical descendants and the spiritual descendants of Abraham Avinu, Abraham our father. Okay? The Torah would be that mediating agent, of course, the fullness of which would be Messiah himself, who is the Torah in the flesh. And Israel was called to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Though the people were his representatives, without Torah, there could be no holy nation, because Torah was the entity used by our God to separate the people. It was the light by which the people would minister to the surrounding nations. Though the people were his representatives, without Torah there was no light. In fact, with no Torah, we see what happens. There was only darkness, curses, the ridicule of nations, and eventual dispersion of the people. That even though there was Torah, when the people chose by action to declare that there wasn't a Torah and wanted to assimilate themselves into the nations, what happens? They become the scorn, right? The name of God is ridiculed, which is one of the main reasons that the dispersions were in existence. And Adonai, the latter part of Ezekiel, declares that one day is coming that when the nations surrounding nations come against Israel, he doesn't do it for the sake of his people. He says, I'm doing it for my name's sake, to restore my honor. And the children of Israel, and much later on, those who grafted themselves into, were the instrument, along with Torah and Messiah as the end, as the fulfillment of it all, the perfection of it all. That was the ultimate instrument by which the light of God was to be shown to all the peoples of the nations. The Torah is at the very heart of this. So let's start to unravel the various understandings of Torah And traditionally, Torah is seen as 613 commandments. Some of this is going to be a review for you, but I can't say I'm sorry because review is always very important. So I won't apologize for it. We all need to get our gears oiled on a regular basis. Okay? Torah is traditionally seen as 613 commandments. Now, some of this terminology is really important, and part of this course really is to get into your mind ingrained terminologies, okay? And sometimes you'll hear words that, oh, I don't know what that means, or you may not want to go talk to someone about what that means. The word for commandment is mitzvot, so whenever you hear that, we're talking about the commandments in the Torah. That's the plural. The singular, mitzvah, okay? Tayav mitzvot is what these 613 are known as traditionally, and that is because of the numerical aspect of the Hebrew here. And it's a real intricate system of numerology that exists within Judaism, and I'm not saying that I espouse it all, nor do I agree with it all, but we're looking right now at the traditional aspect of it. The 613 are Tayav mitzvot, and there you have the numerical aspects of each Hebrew letter that end up with 613. But what we find out is that not all 613 are necessarily found in the first 5 books of Moses, that they are comprised of both positive and negative commandments, that is, do's and don'ts, positive and negative. Only 606 are found in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and 7 of those are what we would call rabbinic additions. So, it's an interesting fact as well. This concept of 613 goes all the way back to the 3rd century. Rabbi Simlai is quoted as saying 613 precepts were communicated to Moses, 365 negative precepts, and 248 positive. And I didn't get into this class as far as what's applicable today, but it's vastly less than this. Okay? Vastly less than the 613 that we can actually apply to our lives outside of the construct of the temple, outside of the sacrificial system, outside of the land of Israel. Certain commandments only apply to the land. Many commandments apply only to a temple with a sacrificial system, ceremony and all that. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The rabbis also give various interesting midrashim or interpretations as to what the 365 and the 248 connote, sinews and bones in the body and all these types of things. It's very mystical, and again, I don't necessarily espouse that, but it's very interesting, to say the least. Those 613 of the Torah fall into what we see as 3 main categories. The first being what we call edut, and that's the plural, edah, and those are the testimonies. The edut are comprised of festivals and other rituals that testify to important spiritual truths. These are many of those practices, many of the holidays. All of them point to an incredible Torah revelation or a spiritual truth, something much deeper than is on the surface. These festivals, these times of celebration, remind us of God's presence and His incredible faithfulness. Now I'm going to try not to go too fast here, but I got to keep up somewhat of a pace, so I apologize for that. Chukim are the second. Those are commandments whose reasons aren't obvious. And there are many of those chukim. Those are the do's and the do-nots, the positives and the negatives, whose reasons are neither obvious nor explained. These are sometimes translated as requirements or regulations. Under chukim fall mitzvot, or commandments that we know of as the Leviticus 11 dietary laws, the not mixing of fibers, so on and so forth, etc.